Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to continue our discussion of D3 and we're going to work on lines and scales. Okay. Um, if you've already downloaded this repo, be sure to download the latest one because I made a couple changes since the last session. And, in the last session, we worked on the challenges here in the D3 intro. So that gave us some basic D3 skills. And now we're going to work on the items in the D3 scales folder here. So I'm going to download this repo by clicking the button and choosing download as zip. And I'll open up this this folder here in VS Studio, and here we are. So I'm going to arrange the window and then launch the HTML document in a browser. So I'm using the localhost server here, the live server in VS Code. Okay, so what is a scale? A scale is a way of normalizing values. Basically, a scale lets us convert a range of values that might be in dollars or radians or miles per hour or any range of numbers that your data might contain. The scale allows us to scale those numbers or normalize them to a range of something that we can show on the screen, right? So for example, we might want to take miles per hour, but graph it to pixels on the screen, or we might want to take, number of dollars sold and scale it to a range of colors, or change it to a vertical position or a horizontal position on the scale on the screen, or a width and a height, right? Because we might have dollars in millions or billions, but we need to convert it into 100 or 1 to 500 pixels or something like that, right? Okay, so here we're on lab number 3, and we're going to go into lab 3.js right here and take a look at this, right? So there's a couple examples here that show lines and scales at work, right? And we're looking at this first example here in, example using linear scales, okay? So here we are, let's take a look. So make a linear scale, and you can see here we've got the X scale, and it says D3 linear, scale linear, domain, and range, right? So with a scale, there's two important factors for us, right? So, if I was to separate the code here, like break this down into parts, really what we're doing is we're calling D3 scale linear, and then that returns an object, and we call dot domain on that object, and then that returns an object, and we call dot range on that object, right? So, essentially I've kind of written our code like this, right? So we call D3 scale linear, and then we call domain and range, right? And we could rewrite this to, you could write it as, you could write it like this, and that would look the same, right? So scale, I've got an object here that was returned from scale linear, and then I'm just calling domain on it, and then I have it again, and I'm going to call range on it. But, we can, since D3 always returns the current object, right, we can chain these methods off of the original call, okay? So what is a domain and what is a range, right? So now that we know kind of the mechanic of the JavaScript there, like what is it doing, right? So the domain represents the range of values from your data, right? The domain of values, like think of domain as being like the domain of the world, right? So, if I have numbers here that represent, months, so actually this X scale right here is showing me some sales data, and the sales data is spread across the screen in months. It's like January, March, or wait, I guess that's January, March, April, May, June, right? Okay. So these are spread across here in months. And the range, though, is the range of values on the screen. So domain is numbers from the real world and the range that those numbers, extend into in the real world. And range is the range of values that we want to convert those numbers to. So here we're converting a range of 1 to 10 months, maybe it should have been 12 months, right? Okay, into a range of 0 to 500 pixels, right? Because this block right here is 500 pixels wide. Okay, so, and we can experiment with this. So it might help also to look at our data. So I'm loading D3 JSON. I'm calling to load monthly sales JSON. Let's go take a look at that file for a moment. So I'll go into data here and I'll look up monthly sales, right? So it says, month is number 1, month is number 2, month is number 3, month is number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, and then there's also a property called sales on here. Okay, so I've got an array of objects with properties of month and sales, object, month, and sales, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to convert all those month values, 1 to 10 in our example, into a range of pixel locations on the screen, the X scale, right? Okay, so there's our scale right there, and notice that domain takes an array of values. And it gives us the starting value and the ending value, so the minimum value and the maximum value. You can use this in different ways, but the main way you're going to use it is provide the minimum and the maximum, right? And range is the same way. So we put in here a range of values, minimum to maximum. Let's experiment with this for a minute. So this SVG is 500 pixels wide, but if I was to put in, let's say, 25 pixels here, notice that the circle on the end here got pushed over 25. So our minimum range is 25. So if something in the domain has a value of 1, it's going to be at 25 pixels, right? So let's imagine that the last domain here, if you looked at my months, it actually had the last month here is number 10, right? So so we don't actually have a whole year worth of months. So if I set the last one here to 10, you can see that the last circle goes off the edge of the screen at 500 pixels, right? Because this SVG here is 500 wide. So if I wanted to bring this in, 25 pixels, right? Then I could put in here, put 475, and then the last month on the range is going to be 475. Okay. So wait, let's back up 1 second. So we made a scale here. Like, what is this scale? This scale, actually, you'll notice I haven't even created any objects yet here. So actually, the scale itself doesn't position these things. Okay, it's just a function that returns a value. You give it one of these values, and it returns a value within this range. So you give it a value, this function right here, we're going to call it. We're going to provide a value that's inside the domain, and then the X scale is going to convert that value into a value in the range. So this is what we did earlier manually, right? We normalized values, right? And so this is just a function that generates a normalized value, right? So let's talk about how it works now for a minute. I'm going to scroll a little further down here, and you can see here I'm generating my D3 select. I'm adding a border on it. That's why we see the border around the outside. And then I'm going to select all the circles. So I'm going to draw these circles, right? And to position each circle, I'm going to set the CX, or the center X, for the circle. And I'm going to provide a function here to return the value. So this gives me one of my data objects from the data that we set, which should be an object with a month and a sales property. And over here, I'm going to call X scale on that object and then give it the month, right? So when I give it the month, that's a value in the domain. It normalizes that value to a value, or returns a value within the range, okay? Fascinating, right? Okay, so here's your challenge right now. What I'd like to do is take the sales data here and use it also to set the y-axis for the circle, okay? And currently, like I set the CY for each circle to 200, but what we want to do is make a Y scale that takes in the sales amount and then returns a value within the domain, so or within the range. So the sales amount will be our domain, and the 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 height of the SVG will be our range. So the height of the SVG here is 400. It's 500 wide by 400 tall. Okay. So you can stop the video and give that a try. Use the example here for the X scale, and then follow this right here to do the Y scale. Okay. Okay, so how did you do, right? Well, let's take a look. So I've got the Y scale here, right? D3 scale linear. Um, and then I'll talk about this in a moment, but I did a little different way to get the minimum and maximum values there, right? Because I don't know what they are, right? So we'll talk about how to get those. So what we're going to do down here is we're going to put in D equals Y scale, and then I want to plug in my domain value, which is going to be d.sales. Oh, there, and now my circles go all over the map, right? Okay, maybe let's play with the value here. So this is 0 to 400, but maybe if I don't want the bottom one to be right on the edge, I want it to come up maybe 25, so I'll put 25 there, or actually I guess that's the top value, right? And then the bottom value, maybe I don't want it to hit the bottom, so I'll make it 375, right? And this is actually, if you notice, like the shape of this, it's actually the opposite of this one. So the large numbers are at the bottom and the small numbers are at the top. So we can invert our range by swapping the two numbers, right? So there we go, right? So now here we got the min value will be 375, and the maximum value will be 25 at the top. So remember, like our X scale is like 0 on the left, high numbers on the right, 0 at the top, and higher numbers as you go down. Okay, so anyway, so that's kind of working for us. So here's your challenge now is for this particular scale here, I have a couple blocks of code. I have a scale here. I have a second scale here. And then I have a block of code here that draws the circles, right? So this block draws the circles. And then at the bottom here, we're going to draw the months. So the months section down here draws the text object that says the months on there, right? So let's talk about that one in a moment. But your challenge here is to use the Y scale right here to set the location of the month so it's kind of next to the circle. So you can stop the video and give that a try. Okay, great. How did you do? Let's try it out. So I'm going to go to the Y scale here, and I'll use, or the Y, attribute.y to set the Y position of the text. I'll put Y scale in here. Actually, I'll put data and then have a function that's going to return the value from the Y scale. So we'll say Y scale d dot, was it sales? Yeah, that's it, right? Oh, there we go. Okay, so that's not too bad, the numbers and the names and the circles are overlapping, but don't worry about that. We can fix that later. But there we've drawn something, we've put a label on it. Okay, so let's talk a little more about these scales. So what's interesting here is you'll notice that actually, let's change the color for the circle. I did the fill as black, but let's do the fill as like a light gray. There we go. Right now we can see the month name, right? Okay. Okay, so next thing about scales, right? So we used a scale linear, so that means the step between each value is going to be equal. Okay. So if I've got 10 months along here or 12 months, then the space between each month, like if I drew vertical lines here, the space between each month is equal, okay? Right? So let's talk about another type of scale, okay? So there's another type of scale called an ordinal scale. So the ordinal scale lets us create a set of fixed values from the domain, okay? So imagine that our domain is the months and it goes from 1 to 12. And I want to convert these numbers into the names of the months, right? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an ordinal scale, right? So scale ordinal. And then I'll set my domain just like I would normally. And then I'm going to set the range. But this time when I set the range, I'm going to just give it an array of the possible values. Okay, so those are the array of my possible values, right? And this could be anything really, right? In my case, I'm going to use the month scale that we created from the scale ordinal. So here's month scale right here. I'm going to use that to set the text that's displayed on the text object. So here I'm making, D3, I'm selecting example 0. I gave it a border. I selected all the text elements, right? And then I appended text elements. And the text element is an SVG element that draws like letters, right? Or numbers, right? Text, right? And what you can do here is you give it the, if you call the text property, it sets the inner text of that element. We saw this with HTML and D3, okay? So if we call scale or the month scale, the ordinal scale, and we provide a value in the domain, the scale maps that value onto one of these possible choices. Okay, so these are the only choices available and it maps to one of these choices, okay? So anyway, so give that a try. Try changing the range of values here to something different just for fun, just to see what it shows up as, right? And we'll move on to the next challenge in the next video. But you can read through here. And you can try these on your own. This one's gonna talk about drawing the line graph, and you can see we got a line graph here with these numbers on it, right? So we'll do that in the next video.